Hello everyone, this is Sabrar Ahmed, Assistant Professor in English, C. Abdul Hakim College, Melu Sharam, Tabelnad. In this small video clip, we shall discuss what English poetry is. There is no definite definition for a poetry, but we have so many definitions given by various poets. Dr. Johnson, very famous poet, he is the first person who composed dictionary in English. He says that poetry is a metrical composition. So, poetry is a composition of musics or words that looks like a music. Then Carroll, one of the famous poet, he says that it is a musical thought that is expressed in the form of words, in the form of verses, is called poetry. Shelley, one of the famous romantic poets, he says the expression of imagination. The imagination of the poet, the imagination of an author is expressed in the form of verse. That's called poetry. Wordsworth, the hero of the romantic poet, he says, the breadth and finer spirit of all knowledge. Poetry is the breadth. Poetry is the soul of all knowledge, whatever it may be, science, social science, life science, history, geography, whatever it may be, poetry is the soul of those branches of knowledge. Experts of those fields can get ignited if he or she reads a poem. Poem gives him a new pleasure. Poem gives him a new enlightenment to study his subject of interest. Allan Poe, he says that the rhythmic creation of the beauty is created in the form of rhythm, is called poetry. T.S. Eliot, one of the classical poet of 20th centuries, he says that the vehicle of feelings. Poetry is a vehicle of feelings. The feelings of the people can be transformed, can be sent from one to another with the form of poetry. And it has to give pleasure. The main purpose of a poetry is to give pleasure to the reader. Robert Frost, he says that when an emotion has found its thought and that thought has found words, it's called beautiful, right? What does he say? When an emotion has found its thought, right? When a person has got a correct, suitable word to express, that's called poetry. And the thought has found words, and that thought has got a correct word, suitable word, then it becomes a poetry. As we have so many popular and memorable verses, we can just recollect. A thing of beauty is a joy forever. This is, of course, a paraphrase. What is the actual line? Beauty is truth, truth is beauty. This is what said by John Keats. If it is beautiful, definitely there will be a truth. If it is truth, definitely it will be a beautiful. This is what, when an emotion has found its thought and the thought has found words. What are the characteristics of features of a poetry? Right? In a poetry, we will have imagination, emotion, feeling, truth. These are the components of a poetry. Likewise, verse, meter, rhyme, rhythm. These are the things, these are the features of poetry. Altogether is called poetry. Embodiment of these is called poetry. Function of poetry. What is the function? The poetry teach as well as delight. When you read poetry, definitely, if you know the meaning of that particular verses, definitely you will get delighted. As we have beautiful words by Robert Frost, woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. See how delightful it is, and how important it is, right? Here I am not to describe or to explain those four verses, but you can find teaching as well as delight in that four verses, what we call quatrain. Then poetry will entertain, poetry will enlighten us, poetry will give a new enlightenment that will help to live a very happy and decent life. It reveals the spiritual world. We, with the help of our two eyes, we can see the materialistic world. But if we read poetry, or a poet can see a spiritual world as such, as in our country, Rabindranath Tagore, the first recipient of Nobel Prize, if we read his Gitanjali, we can have an enlightenment. We can understand his spiritual world. We can understand his spiritual capacities. Right? The whole poem is about spiritual things, spiritual messages. And as we discussed, it opens inner eyes, what we call intuition. Then interpretation of life through imagination and feelings. The poetry interpret the meanings of life through imagination and feelings. The poetry give us a formula to live a decent and meaningful life. And we have two types of poetry, subjective as well as objective poetry. Records of poet's own thought and feeling is called subjective poetry. Expressions of his personal opinions and intuition will be there. Experience of the hard and brain. The more focus will be on his intuition and on his knowledge. These are the examples of subjective poetry: lyric, elegy, sonnet, and ode. These will come under the category of subjective poetry. Like we have objective poetry, record of poet's observation and experiences. What he observes, what he sees is recorded in the form of poetry. It is less passionate compared to subjective poetry, and it treats subject objectively. And in objective poetry, the experiences of ears and eyes are described. What he sees or what he listens is described in objective poetry or objective literature. Ballad folk songs is one of the examples of objective poetry. What are the forms of poetry? Ode is one of the form of poetry. Sonnet, a 14-line poems. Elegy, a poem that expresses sadness over the death of somebody. Epic, a long narrative poem. Ballad, a poem that tells us a story. Idyll, mock epic, satire. These are the forms of English poetry. Thank you.